Hello, the CAS review, which has come out really recently, has set out new guidance around the treatment of young trans people since hormone blockers have been banned. And because I've hugely benefited from hormone blockers, I was interviewed by Channel 4 to express my views on the guidance.
What was your first interaction with the Tavistock with JITs?
So I was about 13. My kind of parents took me there for an assessment. I remember it being relatively thorough and quite invasive. I did quite an extensive questionnaire at the time. I think they helped me to meet another trans person, make me feel less alone. So it was quite an intensive but obviously very useful service. I remember when I first started getting involved, I was very angry that I couldn't get on blockers as soon as possible, because obviously I was going through or starting to go through female puberty, and as a man that's quite a scary thing to go through. So I was quite desperate to get on hormone blockers as soon as I could, but the Tavistock were very firm in that they had a process to go through. They had to do set assessments over a number of months. It took me, I think, 18 months in total to get onto hormone blockers, and that's 18 months of therapy. But I think now it's much, much longer.
How important was it for you to access care, to access treatment at a really young age?
Oh, really important. I mean, because the changes in that you experience through puberty, they're irreversible, and those changes are terrifying, dysphoria inducing, and obviously dysphoria is associated with lots of mental health issues. So to be able to access care and to be able to prevent that is really life changing, and I'm incredibly lucky that I've been able to get on it as early as I have, such that I haven't gone through too much female puberty, such that I can live a normal life. I think it's quite difficult to understand how difficult that puberty can be, the wrong puberty can be, but I think other people can understand with care about that what she went through is horrible, and I completely agree, what she went through was absolutely awful, and that's because she went through the wrong puberty. What blockers do is prevent us from going through the wrong puberty. So by preventing access to blockers, they'll be essentially condemning many trans people to the same fate that she went through, which is really scary for me and for my friends.
So what's the impact if care now, as it is sort of, as we're in this sort of interim period, obviously, is now significantly delayed? It's going to be available at a much later age to young people. What's the impact of that going to be?
So the impact of the delayed treatment, I mean, the waiting time is just awful. Like, the fact that you know that you're going through these dysphoria-inducing permanent changes, and the fact that you know there's nothing that you can do to control it, and it's happening in your own body, and it affects every aspect of your life. That period in itself is horrible, and then the fact that it means that people can only go on hormone blockers at a later stage, so they go through more puberty, and that will affect them for the rest of their life. So that's a permanent change. So when we're worried about care and we're worried about preventing permanent changes, if we allow these puberties, the wrong puberty, to go through, that is also incredibly dangerous. So I don't think there's a neutral option here. I don't think you can prevent treatment by saying, oh, I'm worried about doing harm, and so I'm not going to allow for blockers. In fact, by allowing that puberty to happen, there's harm involved.
And can we sort of talk specifically about waiting lists? That's been massively increased now in the last couple of years. It will increase as a result of this. Can you just take me through quite slowly, I guess, what is the impact of a waiting list, what it will mean for people at the moment, and if there are people you know, obviously, you know, naming no names, but sort of who are on that, what are they going through particularly right now?
Yeah. So being on a waiting list, it's really quite a stressful and scary time. You kind of don't really feel in control of your health or anything like that. The clinics seem relatively difficult to reach out to. You feel like you've been forgotten. You feel like you're not being given the appropriate treatment. So for my friends that are still on waiting lists, that's really frustrating for them, and really, really scary for them, and they feel left behind, and that they're not being given the treatment that will effectively change their life. I mean, if you're on if you go through too much of the wrong puberty, it will affect everything from how you look, how your voice, how you're read, how other people treat you. It's like you'll see yourself every day in the mirror and see like a face that's not the right face. It's pretty life-changing to have to go through the wrong puberty, and for those people that are on the waiting list to know that that's going to happen, that they're going to get to that stage where they've gone through those irreversible puberty changes. That's, I think, pretty terrifying for them, and it was for me. When I was on the waiting list, I was really frustrated and terrified, because I knew that it would be permanent, and I was like, I need this to stop now. I can't leave the house, I can't speak on the phone. It's quite a difficult time to be on a waiting list.
And am I right, you've got friends who are on those kind of waiting lists at the moment?
Not at the moment, but they will.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
What kind of things would they be going through? Or I guess, let me rephrase that. The impact of the report so far and what we'll expect is that those delays will increase. What will be the impact on people who were like yourself a few years ago, knowing that treatment will now be taken longer to access, if they can access it at all?
Yeah. So I guess extending the waiting list will just mean that they know that there's no light at the end of the tunnel. At least with me, I knew that eventually I would get on hormone blockers. I knew that there was a process. What the minimum was, like 4 to 6 months worth of assessments. I knew that I'd be able to get to that point, and blockers were like a safe place to assess and to figure out what I wanted. But there will be no hope for them. They will be sitting on this waiting list, waiting for God knows what, knowing that they've been left behind and let down by the NHS.
There will be lots of people who will say, waiting is good for young people. Let's delay everything until 16, until 18, because when you're an adult, you can make more informed decisions about your own health. How do you view that argument?
Okay. So I see that children obviously don't have the emotional capacity to make these informed decisions, but we do think we can make irreversible operations on children because we view that it's in their best interest. And I think if we do the appropriate assessments, if there's a thorough enough assessment process, then we can know that the treatment is in the child's interest, even though maybe the child themselves isn't even capable of understanding that. We can know how serious dysphoria is. We know that dysphoria is associated with all these mental health issues. We know that blockers prevents that association, so we can make that judgment that it is in the child's best interest. And on the avoiding harm argument, because I understand we don't want any irreversible changes happening to children, but I don't think there's a neutral option here. If we allow these children to go through these puberties, that is irreversible for them. Either way, you can go on to blockers, you can give them time to assess, and then they can go on to hormones if they want, which is a separate assessment process. Or you can allow them to go through these irreversible damaging puberties that we know that we can judge that they shouldn't be going through, and we know how horrible that is because we know how horrible what Kira Bell went through was. When we see the footage, we can see how her voice is deeper and she's got facial hair, and everything about her appearance has changed, and that's deeply awful. But that will be the same fate. Trans kids will be condemned to the same fate if blockers are banned.
Thanks. I want to sort of slightly turn, I guess, to the future. Will, in theory, there'll be some version of what kind of best practice for gender questioning trans kids will look like. In your view, and kind of based on your experience, what is best practice? What would the perfect situation be that a young kid can go through who's, turned to their parents and their doctors and said, look, this is how I feel?
Yeah. I'm not sure I'm qualified, but on the For best practice, I'm kind of thinking something quite similar to the Tavistock's existing process. Shorter waiting lists would be appreciated because while someone's on a waiting list, they're not being assessed. I'm happy for them there to be like a year or two assessment period, as long as there's regular enough therapies, because those therapies themselves can be very helpful. So I'm very in favour of like a thorough, rigorous assessment process, but just with reduced waiting times and with under 16s being able to access these treatments. Because once we have that thorough assessment, we know that the blockers are in the child's best interest and we can prescribe them safely.
And just on that sort of sense of being seen, of having care, I think we mentioned it before we started, but how important if you're on a waiting list, if you're now one of the thousands of people who is stuck kind of trying to reach care but can't get it at the moment, how important would support be, whether that's straightforward therapy sessions or even any sort of aspect of recognition, support from the NHS? What do those people deserve? What should they be getting now? How would it help them?
I think that's what. So I guess I can only talk from my experience. It seems important to have some sort of validation or support so that children can have some support in their families. So for me, when I went to the Tavistock, my family saw the fact that I was being assessed by them as like some sort of external proof that I was trans. So some sort of affirmation of that, almost like permission to transition within a family, can be incredibly helpful. Because to be trans and young, it's incredibly isolating, because you have the entire world telling you that you're not trans, you're just confused, you're too young, all these things. So to have some sort of affirmation from the Tavistock for their families, I think that would be really transformative. I think a lot of the reasons why people detransition is social pressure, and that social pressure can come a lot from families. I think schools are much better now. At least it seems like you can transition in most schools without like a diagnosis or anything like that. But if that could be made the case within all schools, because my school didn't let me, that would be much appreciated. And on the therapy side, I'm not sure how helpful therapy is. I would love for it to be helpful, but yeah, I don't know what the evidence says, so that would be what I defer to.
This might sound, you don't necessarily have to answer this, you're not comfortable with. Sort of, what's your view on the state of what Sean Fay calls the transgender issue in that sense of, as a nation, it has been a turbulent few years, and I don't think anyone thinks it's sort of gotten better in our ability to have these conversations to get on. You don't have to answer if you're not comfortable with it, but how do you view kind of where we are as a country to be able to talk about this sort of thing?
So in terms of the way I see the dialogue, it does seem quite divisive. It does seem like there are loads of different opposing views to trans people, and they're not even particularly consistent. Like sometimes, at least if it's a polarized political issue, you have, I know what the opposing side is saying and I can understand them and I can respond to them. But often we get opposition from the right and the left, and some of the arguments are inconsistent. So it feels like an attack from all fronts, and it feels quite difficult to understand and to respond to. Like some attacks are very, very medicalized, using terms like transsexual and stuff like that, saying that transition isn't enough. Others, I don't know, just you can't even categorize them because it's just so broad.
Are we doing enough as a culture to look after the welfare of trans kids?
As a culture, I mean, it looks like we're probably not doing enough as a culture to look after trans kids, especially support for trans kids in families and in schools. If we can change the narrative around that, it still seems like people are worried that trans kids are too young to be making these types of decisions. There's a lot of misinformation around when trans kids are going through like medical procedures. Like there's a lot of talk of young teenagers going through surgeries, which is not the case at all and shouldn't be the case. The only thing that kind of young teenagers can do without assessment is to socially transition, and that's absolutely harmless. And I'd love for kind of families and schools to be much more accepting of that.
And I guess just sort of to try and find a kind of optimistic place to end. What's your hope for how treatment for trans kids, how care for young people gets in the next couple of years? Where, you know, what's your sort of optimistic view on what we can do better, how we can be better?
My hope is a relatively short waiting list, and still quite a kind of a rigorous assessment process like the Tavistock's, and I understand that that'll be quite frustrating for some trans kids, but I do think it's necessary to make sure it's in the best interest. So maybe a process of like 6 months to a year of assessment, but alongside that, some good therapy. My Tavistock therapist was pretty good, but that didn't seem to be the purpose of it. It was like a side note. So kind of integrating the therapy more into the service would be great. If we could have like an assessment, an appointment, and then a therapy appointment, that would be great. Or if we could integrate the family more into the treatment, because hearing that your child is trans is like a kind of an adjustment and sometimes a loss for an entire family. Like you can think of, I don't know, my dad wanted to walk me down the aisle, so for him to lose his little girl is quite an adjustment for him. So if families can get that kind of support, that would be great as well.
That's brilliant. I just want to go back just to make sure I can remember kind of what the answer was if we had it exactly, but I just wanted to ask one more again, which was how important, how much of a difference did it make being seen and having treatment at a young age for you?
So I think it made a world of difference. So the period, so I think having treatment as early as it did and being seen as early as I was made a world of difference. So the period itself of waiting for the assessment is a really scary process because you feel so out of control. You know that these changes that your body is going through, they're absolutely irreversible, and the fear of that, the dysphoria that brings and the mental health issues that brings, being on the waiting list and not being seen, that's pretty horrifying. And then it has lifelong consequences. These changes that trans people experience when they go through the wrong puberty, these are permanent, and these are permanent and awful in the same way that the changes that Kira Bell went through are permanent and awful. People can understand that she has a deeper voice and her face has changed and she probably has more facial hair. And I agree that's absolutely awful for her, and at least most people can sympathise with that. But it's the same fate. If you prevent trans children from being allowed on blockers, they will experience the same fate. If I wasn't allowed on blockers as early as I was, I would have experienced more of a female puberty. I wouldn't have been able to pass, and that would have affected me for the rest of my life. And that thought that children now aren't being allowed to do that is pretty terrifying.
That's brilliant. You're fantastically eloquent. I don't know what the question is, I guess. I suppose the setup to that was sort of how important is getting treatment earlier? How important was having care so early for you?
Okay, so getting treatment is just so important. Getting treatment early is just life-changing. So the process of waiting for treatment is pretty horrifying. You know that you're going through permanent changes through puberty. You feel so unseen. You're not getting any support. Sometimes your family is kind of against you. So it's your school. It feels like you're not being seen at all. And the knowing that you're going through these permanent changes that I have to emphasize will last for the rest of your life. That's pretty terrifying, but I think it's quite difficult for non-trans people to understand that. So a reframing that I like is to think about detransitioners, so people who have gone through kind of the wrong puberty, medically induced, but then have realised that they're not trans and have regretted it. So I think many people can understand how difficult that experience is for them. They too will experience permanent changes. There's a lot of women who have permanently deeper voices, permanent facial hair, permanent changes to their faces, all that kind of thing. And that is horrible for them, I agree. But if you prevent trans people from being able to transition, if you prevent puberty blockers, you are condemning trans people to the same fate. If I wasn't allowed on puberty blockers at the time that I would have gone through irreversible female puberty, and that would have affected me for the rest of my life. That would have affected my ability to leave the house. That would affect maybe my voice, my ability to take phone calls, just my image in myself. And we know how associated dysphoria is with mental health issues, and we know how well blockers and cross-sex hormones can prevent those mental health issues. So having the treatment as early as I did really did change, if not save, my life.
That was really, yeah. You went through something. It's maybe not a big part.
Yeah. So luckily now I'm 21. Being trans is not a major part of my life. It was a really, really big part when I was transitioning, because it was so salient that I was going through. Especially when I was going through puberty, that was such a kind of terrifying point in my life. But now, luckily, I've kind of moved on. So yeah, I'm 21. I'm just finishing my Maths and Philosophy degree at Durham. I was going to say transition has allowed me to live a relatively normal life, but I use the word normal very loosely because I'm quite a nerd. Alongside my degree, I run like a university society, which is loads of work, but I love it. And I'm a Samaritan, which is the mental health listening thing, which is like really rewarding for me. So I'm just incredibly lucky that I've been able to kind of transition, put that beside me, and then now I can kind of move on and live as close to kind of my best life as I can.
And what are you studying?
Maths and Philosophy. So quite.
Do you mind just sort of saying that in a full sentence, because my brilliant question won't be concluded.
In the context of, shall I do the whole thing again?
Just start with like I study, or I mean you don't have to say where you go to university as well if it's sort of not anything you want.
So I'll just do loads.
Also, just look at us.
Oh yeah. So when I was transitioning, being trans was such a huge part of my life. It was so terrifying to kind of be on those waiting lists, to go through that puberty, to know that it's irreversible. But I'm really lucky now. Now I'm 21. Now I've basically fully transitioned. Being trans is not a big part of my life, and I can live hopefully a relatively normal life. I use the word normal very loosely because I'm quite a nerd. I study Maths and Philosophy at Durham, and I'm really lucky in that I'm able to pursue that, and alongside some really fun hobbies. So I run a society, and I really enjoy that, even though it's loads of work. And I'm a Samaritan, which is like the mental health phone line thing. I'm a listening volunteer for that. And to be in a place, obviously that's quite emotionally intensive, to be in a place where I'm able to provide that therapy for other people. That is amazing. The fact that my mental health is good enough that I can do that. I'm just like so incredibly lucky that I've been able to put being trans aside, to be able to like go on with my life and to live as close to a full and amazing life as I can.
Thanks, that was yeah.